This is an interview with Dave Cutting. It's being held on July 31st at 2003 at Mr. Cutting's office in Ithaca, New York. My name is Tom Mailey, and I am a volunteer with the Library of Congress program. Okay, to start with, Dave, could you just kind of recap some of your personal data, like your birth date and where you were born, and what branch of the service you were in, and what rank you achieved, and where you served, and so forth?
Well, I'd be happy to, Tom. I was born in Rome, New York, April 22nd of 1922, and lived there with an uncle. My father had been a Cornellian in the class of 18, and of course all I heard was Cornell, Cornell. I moved from Rome to Syracuse when I was about 13, went through high school in Rome, was very involved in sports, played hockey, played soccer, and was president of my class in high school, and always worked. I always had a job. I was running a post-standard route in the morning, and on the weekends I worked at a country club, Drumlin's Country Club, and I was on the fountain making sundaes and so on. But I learned to work, and I think that's one of the good things about my life. I did work for one summer in Revere Brass and Copper. I finished high school in January and went right into the mill and realized I didn't want to work in the mill the rest of my life. But I did make enough money to pay most of my first year at Cornell. I never had any money from my father at all for my education. My uncle did have $500 set aside. There again, I think that was a good thing. I had to work for it. I came to Cornell in the fall of 1941 as a freshman in the School of Hotel Administration. The fact that I'd worked at the country club helped me get into Cornell, into the hotel school. I lived in one of the dorms in College Town, and of course vividly remember December 7th of 1941. I was listening to a New York Philharmonic Orchestra, doing my homework, and of course the intrusion into the newscast that Pearl Harbor had been hit made me realize that I would have to do something. I had taken ROTC because at that time, being a land-grant school, Cornell, it was mandated that you took ROTC. I didn't like ROTC. I didn't like the shirt, it itched. I didn't like to be told where to stand, and I just decided I'm not going to do ROTC for 2 years. I probably won't graduate from Cornell, but I'm not going to do ROTC. With the strike on Pearl Harbor, everyone was eager to be in the service. My father had been a Navy pilot in World War I, and I knew I'd done a little flying, just getting a chance to fly in small planes once in a while. Realized that that's where I would really like to be, would be in the Air Corps. I did enlist, and I wasn't called until about May of 1942. And then I entered the cadet program. We went to Atlantic City for classification. That was about 3 or 4 weeks of quite a lot of marching and a lot of exams, physical exams and mental exams. So many young men wanted to be in the Air Corps that they didn't have any place to put us. They didn't have enough bases with airplanes. So we were sent to college training detachments. I wound up back in Syracuse, New York. And it was kind of interesting. They brought the whole group, perhaps 150 men, in a big assembly hall and asked if anyone had ROTC. Well, I'd had about a month of ROTC, so I went to the front of the line, and the cadet captain said, "And where did you have ROTC?" "Cornell, Cornell, step out." And I immediately became an officer. I was in charge of a barracks of 40 men. I could come and go as I wanted to, and so that was my start of being in the Air Corps. I went from there. We did some flying there. We had about 10 hours of flying in Cubs, which is a very small plane, and it was interesting just at that stage how many young men were washed out. If you couldn't adjust to being in an airplane, they didn't want you in the Air Corps, of course. I went from Syracuse to Jackson, Tennessee for primary. We were flying open cockpits, PT-19s. It was a Fairchild. It had a little tripod in between the two seats, open seats. In case you did flip over, you wouldn't crash your head. I did love the flying. It was exciting. And we had primarily civil instructors, civilian instructors, I should say. And they were delightful people. They loved flying. And it was just a joy to learn how to fly an airplane. I had a sister, Jane, who was a wonderful diver and could do a beautiful back dive. And I never could do a back dive. But I went out one day and started to do loops. And I didn't do very well, but I did get it over in a full loop. And then I did about 3 more, and I thought, wow, isn't this exciting? I remember going into chow that night with my class, and everyone talks about, what did you do today? Cutting, what did you do today? Oh, I was flying loops. What? You were flying loops? And so that gave me a running start on being a fighter pilot. It was interesting. I was reading a diary, as a matter of fact, Tom, last night, and early on I thought it would be good to be a multi-engine pilot, because after the war, perhaps that's something you could do as a career. But luckily, I stayed as a fighter pilot. I went through basic training, and my instructor there said, you are such a good acrobatic pilot, I'm recommending you for single engine. I went to Craig's Field, and in June of 1944 graduated as a second lieutenant and a pilot.
Where was Craig Field?
Craig Field was in Selma, Alabama. Good field. And my class was 44F, so I graduated in June of 44. I went from there to a P-40 school, did some P-40 flying, and they had signed me up to be an instructor of French cadets. And I remember going in to see the commanding officer, telling him I really want to be a fighter pilot and I want to go to combat. And he said, okay. And he sent me to a P-51 school, and I took about 75 or 80 hours flying the P-51. It's interesting, Tom, there was no way that you could put 2 people in a P-51. So it was ground school, it was cockpit chess, you'd sit in the cockpit, the instructor would tell you what everything was about. And I think of all the things in my entire life that put pressure on me the most was when you were assigned a P-51 to take it up for the very first time, all the upperclassmen were down at the end of the runway watching you come in to make your landing. So I took the P-51 up, flew it for about an hour, got a little feel of it, came in and shot my 3 landings and taxied in. And I was very happy that I had accomplished something. I had flown a P-51. And needless to say, it's like finding a beautiful woman. A P-51, I fell in love with the P-51. It was an exciting airplane. The war was winding down. They did need about 15 pilots to go overseas. I volunteered with a group of another 14 men, and we shipped out and went overseas. And they shipped us out in a B-25, and people say, well, have you ever been to Hawaii? I said, yes, I've been to Hawaii. And in the back of the B-25, we landed at Hickok Field, got out, went to the bathroom, got back in the airplane, and went down and landed in New Guinea. We were in New Guinea for probably 3 or 4 weeks, flying AT-6s. They didn't have any fighters on the strip. What was happening was they wanted to move us up to our squadron that we were going to be assigned to. They were flying P-47s, and they wanted to change from P-47s into a P-51 squadron, and the P-51s hadn't arrived, so I was stuck in New Guinea for probably 2 months waiting for the P-51s to arrive. When they did, we moved up as a group. There must have been 20 replacement pilots, all with 150 or 60 hours of P-51 time. And we moved up to an island called Aishima, which is a stone's throw from Okinawa. And there we joined the squadron and the group, the 348th Fighter Group in the 5th Air Force. We tented 4 in a tent, and one of the close things you do What does happen to you is the closeness with the other pilots that you're flying with. I did find out that the P-47 pilots didn't think much of the P-51. They didn't think too much of the P-51 pilots. I never knew that liquor was given out to combat pilots. You got a 2-ounce shot when you landed after a mission. Never once. I've had about 12 or 14 missions that I get a shot of liquor. It was the P-47 pilots that controlled the liquor cabinet, and I never got trained. So that my missions were there, primarily covering B-24s that were going up and bombing Japan, covering Catalinas, which were used to, if a pilot had to bail out, the Catalina would fly right in and pick him up. And so that the war itself, I had about 3 or 4 missions, strafing, flying low, dropping bombs, and it does give you an interesting feeling when you see the flak coming at you. My gosh, they're shooting at me. So that was a part of it, just flying from an island up to Japan. I became an assistant adjutant and was sent. The reason I became an assistant adjutant, every squadron had to send someone to Manila to be briefed on how we were going to attack Japan, the homeland. So I was in Manila for about 3 or 4 weeks being briefed on what would be happening, and I had been made then an assistant adjutant. You had to have that rank to go back to Manila. I came back to the squadron. The war was pretty much over with, and I wound up really moving so many men out. As you know, the point system was involved then, Bunsen service and so on. And we just depleted our squadrons with all the older veterans. So I had the P-51s left and some good enlisted men, and I became the adjutant of the squadron, which is really the number 2 position in the squadron, and moved the men up to Japan. Before we did get there, though, the commanding officer said, "Cutting, I want to fly with you tomorrow morning. We're going up to Japan." I think I was the first with him. We both flew in P-51s and landed at Ithaca, which is right quite near Osaka, and spent about 3 days there looking at what the Japanese had, going into some of the caves to see the things that were stored in caves, including airplanes. And I realized that how lucky we were that we didn't invade Japan. It would have been a slaughter of the Japanese people. But I did move my group up. I was a group mess officer as well, and I was feeding about 300 men. Then I was assigned to, because I'd been in the hotel school a year and a half, to run a hotel. And that was for field grade and above, captains and above. And I had about 40 rooms, which I was in charge of. We were still flying surveillance missions, though. We were still in the air. We were flying from Itami, which is right near Osaka. That was the airstrip. Because what had happened in Berlin, the division, dividing of that city with the Russians and Americans, they didn't want that to happen in Japan. So we were fully armed, flying surveillance missions, they were called. And luckily we didn't have a problem with the Russians in Japan. I was there for about 4 months in Japan, thoroughly enjoyed it, thoroughly enjoyed the Japanese people. When the Emperor said the war is over, it was over. General MacArthur had an iron hand on controlling the troops. I think our troops, I remember vividly that it came to us that a man had raped a Japanese woman and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. We got the message. And I think MacArthur did a wonderful job in controlling the troops that moved to Japan. So I was there for the 5 or 6 months and then returned to the States, and I came back in May of 1946 and talked to my dean of the hotel school, who said, "Oh, we'll be very happy to have you back coming to Cornell."
What's a Catalina, by the way?
A Catalina is a flying boat that lands on water, and it's a Navy boat. It has guns on the side. It's a very, we cruised at about 250 miles an hour. The Catalina's top speed was 130, so you can imagine flying above them, you're just kind of S-ing back and forth. But they did a superb job. If someone got hit up in the Bay of Tokyo or wherever it might be and had to bail out, they had submarines, they had Catalinas, and that man was picked up. We lost very few pilots because of the wonderful success of the submarines and the Catalinas picking us up.
No helicopters nowadays?
No helicopters. No.
What's the difference between a 47 and a 51?
Well, one's a better plane, the P-51. Actually, they're very similar. I would say this, I think the P-47 would be a better plane to be in if you're low-level strafing. They have a big radial engine, and they're a rugged airplane. For beauty, for class, for speed, for excitement, the P-51, for a combat fighter pilot, that's the plane you want to be in. And I felt very fortunate to be a P-51 pilot. I probably have a total of 230 hours in a P-51. Interesting is, my son learned to fly, and I agreed to pay part of a flight for him, an hour and a half in a P-51 in Florida. The flight cost $3,200 for an hour and a half of P-51 time. So I got a lot of wonderful time in a P-51.
So Rob did a 51 flight on his own?
No, I shared the cost, but he, no, they took out all of the radio equipment that we have, and so it's a bubble, very tight, two people in a P-51. But he loved it. It was wonderful.
Yeah. What succeeded the 51 in the aircraft was, then you go to the F-86 or F-81,
F-80s,
jets,
the
F-80 jets. So that was the last of the piston engine fighter planes, P-51.
I would say it was that, the Watt Corsair. We had some wonderful airplanes. I have flown an F-80. Our friend General Mike Hall used to play hockey for me. He was my defenseman when he was 13, 14, so he and I have been friends for a long time. When I chaired the Empire Games, we had all the athletes from all over the state. I picked up the phone and I said, Mike, he said, I know what you want. Yes, I will bring in some F-80s. So to open the Empire Games in Ithaca, Mike Hall brought in 4 F-80s. He did a north-south pass and an east-west pass. At one of my final wrap-up meetings, he said casually, would you like a ride in F-80? And my gosh, I went up to Syracuse. I have this all on a TV tape and had a ride in F-80. He did an Immelman off the top. Then he said, okay, you got it. And so sure enough, we flew together for about an hour. I told him how we came in from a mission, and we flew right over the runway low, pulled it up in kind of a banana peel to get down fast. Well, if he didn't call the tower Griffith and tell him he wanted to do a low pass, and down he went right on the deck, pulled it up tight, and it's funny, my squawky little voice said, dude, this is wonderful. And then he landed, and so it's a lot of fun then to go from basic trainers with open cockpits and fly an F-80, which he let me do. I flew it up over Camp Drum and had a nice flight.
How is it different in handling than
They don't have the torque, so you don't have to crank in rudder control. It's a very easy airplane to fly.
What's an Immelman?
An Immelman is a half loop. You pull it up in a loop, and you're on your back, and then you roll it out. And it was actually first used in World War I by a man by the name of Immelman, who was a German, and very effective.
Is it a defense strategy to get away?
Basically, a defense strategy.
Right. How did the flying in the service affect your flying today? I mean, I know it up until fairly recently, I guess you still fly, don't you, or do you?
I don't, but we do. I had a very close friend, and when I had to go to meetings in Detroit, he was a professor in the vet school. He'd been a B-25 pilot. His name was Dr. Lou Nangeroni. And every time I wanted to go to Detroit, I'd give him a call. And I'd say, can you work it out? I need to go to Detroit for a meeting on Thursday. Oh, sure. And he just changed his class schedule, and he had a bonanza. One time he called me on the phone and he said, Dave, they're going to come and take my bonanza away. He was a bit of an investor, and he was upside down at the bank. He said, they're going to come this afternoon. Can you do anything? Well, I called a very close friend of mine, Bob Dean, and we met for lunch, and we both agreed to go to the bank and sign a note for $10,000, and we got ourselves a bonanza. And Bob Dean's wife wouldn't let him fly. She didn't think it was a good idea, so I took over his share and gave it to my wife, Marion. And so Marion became the pilot. She now is a fully rated instrument pilot. And I've decided with all the paperwork that goes into flying today, checking the weather, checking the route, that I like the old days when you kind of freewheeled it. And so she is the chief pilot. I fly a little, but not very much.
Is the Bonanza single engine?
Single engine, about 165 horsepower, 200, and it cruises at a good speed, 150 miles an hour.
And Rob flies too?
And Rob flies that too.
Does he have his own plane also?
No, he shares that with, actually Marion owns the airplane, but we use it in business, and it's worked out very nicely. And let's assume that you bought a car, but I don't have it in stock. But in New Jersey, a dealer has it, and I can pick it up on the web. I get in touch with the dealer, call him, he says, oh yes, you can have the car. We will fly someone down the next day. That evening, we will have the car here for you. So it really has broadened what we can do. There are not many automobile dealers that fly their own airplanes to pick up cars. It's worked out beautifully.
What effect do you think being in the service had on you as a person after the service, be it a student, a business person, a husband? I mean,
that's a good question. I would say basically it gave me confidence. When you can fly a fighter, when you can be on oxygen, our missions were 5.5 hours. I think that was probably the turning point in my life, the utter confidence that I had that I could really do anything. And when I came back from school, got back into school, I should say, I found that the studying was much better. I was a much better student, not a top student, but a good student. And I think the confidence that I had being in the Air Corps, it's amazing, Tom, the number of pilots that were washed out along the way. Even when we were in Syracuse flying little Piper Cubs, some of them young men couldn't handle being in an airplane, so they're washed out. In primary, they couldn't handle landings perhaps, or had a problem. They got washed out. Washed out means you're not going to be a pilot, you're not going to be the Air Corps, and you're going to walk with a gun. So that was hanging over our heads. If you wash out, you're going to be an infantryman. So he worked very hard to stay in good shape physically, mentally, and worked very hard to be a pilot. And it was not easy. They had a lot of pressure on us. There are not very many open posts, and you flew in some tough weather.
How did being a pilot, though, affect your approach to projects? I mean, does it affect the way you think about things mentally? Does it help your decision-making processes, for instance? I mean, did you get kind of subtly trained to approach life and projects and issues and
I would say,
a little differently?
I think that I've always felt that I can do anything. I have great confidence. I was very fortunate in marrying a very beautiful person, and we've had a wonderful life with 4 children. So that has been a wonderful part of my life. Running a business, I came to Ithaca in 1941 in the fall, having worked in the mill to earn some money to come to Cornell, and getting a job with a local Buick dealer who had a son my age. And we both drove taxis, and I would drive taxis, and I made a little money just being at Cornell. He was a very dear friend of mine, and when the war was over, we both came back to finish the hotel school. We both graduated in 48. I went into the hotel business for a couple of years and then wound up in Syracuse as a sales manager of a hotel, a large hotel. The dealer died, and I came to the funeral for Mr. Pritchard, and at that service, Gordon, the son, asked me if I would consider coming to Ithaca to join him in the car business, which I did happily. I brought my wife with me from Syracuse and my daughter Jane, who had just been born, and joined Gordon, and we worked together for 4 years. He learned the business, and I learned the business, and we learned it perhaps by making some mistakes along the way. A very tragic thing happened August 1st of 1954. He was drowned. He had been cleaning up a boat that he owned, and he dove into the water, and we never found him. I was there 3 weeks trying to find him. I even hired a diver from New York City to look for him at the bottom. Never found him. And I told his wife, if we do find him, we'll just bury him in a cemetery. I don't really think we should be on the water any longer. And she agreed. About 2 weeks after that conversation, I made an appointment to see her, and I told her, we have 17 employees at the dealership. I would wonder if you would consider letting me buy the dealership. I have $3,000 of my Air Corps money. I will use that as a base, and I'll pay you off over a period of years. She said yes. That's all I've ever put in this business. We now have 2 dealerships. We have 55 people working for us, and we do $25 to $30 million a year in business. Yeah, I would say the Air Corps gave me a lot of confidence.
But have you stayed in touch with many of the people that you were?
Not too many. It's interesting. In fact, that little picture I showed you, one man who bailed out, by the way, in Korea, and they took care of him, and he came back to the squadron. Didn't fly anymore, but he did live. He has died. Another one in our tent was Ken Kano. Ken was a roofer, fell off a roof and was killed. So just one is left from my tent. His name was Lloyd Gillerary, and he was an outstanding P-51 pilot. He made wonderful friends, though, and as an adjutant in the squadron, was very involved with enlisted men, thoroughly enjoyed working with them. I ran the mess hall for a time. I learned to work with people and to be concerned about them. I've never been a boss, and by that I don't give orders. I just say, what do you think about doing this, and get the input from my employees. I've had people work for me 30, 35 years, and I think a part of that is you learn to be and work with people in the service, and I thought it trained me beautifully to be an entrepreneur.
What did you learn about working with people in your service? For instance, I mean, you're fairly young at that point, and all of a sudden you have 300 people working for under your tutelage.
Well, you oversee it that I had from 17, and now it's 55, but in truth,
I mean in the service.
Oh, in the service.
The service.
Well, there's so much of it that's by the book. You do things that you're told to do. An adjutant has certain responsibilities. The head of the squadrons, you met with them. That was one of the things I thought we talked about missions. We were briefed beautifully before we did our missions. I think I did learn to work with a group of people. And one of the things you do working with a group of people is get their input. And that's worked out well.
What was your relationship with your, I don't mean this in any kind of strange way, what was your relationship with your family while you were around? How did you stay in touch? And what did they think about what you were doing? Or what kind of feedback did they give you about the war and your service and so forth?
Well, I did write lots and lots of, I kept complete diaries. I have complete diaries of my years in the service. I was in contact, of course, with my own family, certainly on a weekly basis. And yes, the women in my life, it was kind of fun to go back and realize there are probably 3 or 4 that I wrote to quite continually. I think that was one of the things that being with a group of men, it was nice to know that you had ladies, young ladies that were interested in your career.
What role did the girlfriends, if you will, play with the guys in the service? Was this something that was a great morale booster for them? Was there a lot of conversation about the girls back home and things?
Well, needless to say, when you're 21, 22 years old, women are a big part of your life. I think everyone was writing to someone. And of course they had the canteens for the cadets, and everywhere we went, the local young ladies, there were dances. There was not the intimacy that you move to later in life, but I think the dating was fun. A couple of the women that I dated at Cornell came to visit me on weekends. So yes, women were a part of your life.
Had there been any particular ground action on any of the islands that you were stationed out with, before the planes were stationed out, or had the Japanese attacked any of the islands where you had airplanes?
Well, we were next door to Okinawa. That was one of the biggest battles we had. There was a skirmish on Aishima. I think the biggest thing that I was involved in, other than the flying, was we were hit by a typhoon, and it swept through at about 120 to 30 miles an hour. It devastated our camps, our tents, our whole area was just devastated. And the poor Navy with their ships, the battleships, the cruisers over at Okinawa, I think they had more casualties, more serious injuries to people, and more damage to their equipment at that typhoon than any other thing in the war. It's funny, I've never even seen a write-up about that. I had that in my diary. It was a devastating, devastating wind. And it's interesting, that happened years ago when the Chinese were going to be invading Japan, and it was called the kamikaze wind. And as you know, the kamikaze were the death pilots. These were the men that would auger in on a battleship, just dive straight into it. But the wind was called, at the time when China was invading, the wind was called kamikaze. It was a sacred wind that blew the Chinese fleet away. Here we are on those islands, ready, believe me, ready to attack Japan, and the kamikaze wind hit again. Interesting.
Usually when those things are coming, don't they try and get the airplanes off the island and at another base away from the typhoon?
That's a good question. I honestly can't answer that. I
don't remember.
I don't think we ferried those planes.
So they kind of survived the wind anyway.
I would say they did.
Yeah. That's interesting. Any of the people in your outfit, were you involved with any prisoners of war? I've interviewed a couple of prisoners of war that were actually in Japan.
No, I never knew anyone that was captured. I never knew anyone that was shot down over Japan. We were very lucky in our squad. Realized, though, that when we were toward the end of the war, the Japanese had so few airplanes. I never saw a zero in the sky. And our squadron, of course, kept a scoreboard of how many kills they'd had. And the P-47 pilots, the older pilots, were fanatical about shooting down airplanes. Fanatical. And I think the P-51 boys, we never saw a zero. And so there was a whole different story for us.
Had kind of a John Wayne syndrome going on, the cowboy, you know.
I'd say the P-47 guys, they lived hard, they flew hard, and they drank hard. I mean, they'd drink, and then they'd have a fight. And the P-51 boys just didn't mingle with the P-47 pilots.
You said you landed in Japan once and looked at caves and so forth, and even saw some aircraft stuff. What kind of equipment did the Japanese have? Did they have good equipment to do battle with? Good airplanes? Good armament?
Well, believe me, it was just a visual look. And no, I would say the equipment was nowhere near the caliber of what we had. It was interesting, though, and I reiterate, there was no fear. And we were there probably a week to 10 days after the surrender. We were the commanding officer and myself were the first two in for our squadron. And there was no fear. I have some notes about what the women looked like, all baggy. They carried the loads of whatever it might be on the farm. It was a primitive culture, it seemed to me. Very few vehicles. They had some trucks. You didn't see cars that we have, the way we have them on roads. Even in those days, we had lots of cars. I was amazed that they could put up the tremendous fight that they did with the poor equipment they had.
Have you ever talked to any Japanese fighter pilots or Japanese pilots or Japanese people that were involved in the war effort?
No, I haven't, but I have friends on the Cornell Council that are Japanese, and in fact there was one young man who came to Ithaca. We spent a lot of time with him. He went to the ag school. His father did all the refrigeration for the Olympic Games in Japan. He did does the refrigeration for all of the ships and vessels that are made in Japan. Japan is a very powerful country. They're very creative people, and those that I have known on a first name basis have been friends, which is interesting.
How did you spend your free time in the service, Dave?
A lot of poker. a lot of bridge. We worked out physically, calisthenics, not a must, but they suggested that you do it, which we did. A lot of swimming. It was really wonderful where Ernie Pyle, they have a marker where Ernie Pyle was killed. And it was a great place to swim. I got to know some Navy people, and I was being a mess officer. I was able to get some refrigeration for my own group of people. I got some food. The Navy always had good food. I never was envious of being a Navy person, but boy, they had good commissaries. They ate well. And once in a while, they'd pass a little off to me.
Did you get a relationship between the branches of the service, between the Navy and the Army Air Corps?
You know, we didn't see enough of that to really say that we were all doing a job together, and I'd say, sure, there was probably excellent unity, and I'm sure at the top echelon, they worked very closely on putting the missions together, see what the Navy was going to do. And of course, the Navy had wonderful airplanes. That Black Corsair is one of the best planes that we've ever had. Beautiful airplane.
Did the Army Air Corps maintain planes well? Did they give you good crew chiefs, good ground crew? Did they have the stuff needed to keep the planes in the air in good shape?
Yeah, we had a crew chief. He was in charge of probably 4 or 5 men for each airplane. You had an armament person, you had a radio person, you had an engine person, you had a prop person. When you've been in the squadron long enough, you had an airplane and you could put your name on it. I never had my name on an airplane.
That was an interesting time of your life, though.
Oh, it was exciting.
How come did you ever think about staying in the service?
Never.
How long were you in, actually?
4 years.
Yeah, long enough.
Long enough, and very happy to have done it, very proud to have done it. And of course, you came back after the war, and I was dating girls at Cornell and at Wells, and it was very easy to get a date. When you said you were a fighter pilot, oh, you are a fighter pilot, that there is a charisma about fighter pilots, and I think it's the same today. There's a charisma about being a fighter pilot, and there's a confidence that, cockiness perhaps, but it gives you the feeling that you can do almost anything you want to do, and that's a great feeling.
Never stayed in the reserves?
Never stayed in the reserves, no. When it was over, hey, it's over.
Yeah, that's exactly the same. When I got out after 4 years,
sure.
It's the same thing. But you just don't look back.
Oh, you do. As I say, I have complete diaries, and knowing I was going to chat with you, Tom, I went through some of my diaries and relived the experiences, the excitement of having the instructor walk away and tell you, why don't you take it up and do some flying and then come in and shoot 3 landings. And you solo. You have the plane to yourself. And that's what I liked, I guess, about being a fighter pilot. That was my plane. That's the plane I'm flying. It was an exciting, challenging, wonderful environment. Wonderful group of men, good backgrounds, mostly at least 2 years of college. It was a high point in my life.
And any hard transition from service to Cornell? I mean, there was no culture shock coming from the islands?
Not at all. The nice thing is, I didn't have to take ROTC. So I had my 3 weeks of ROTC, and that was it.
Where were you discharged from?
Jersey City.
Jersey. They just kind of came back from the Far East.
And they were very good. I think we had some money that was given to us. I felt that we were very well taken care of by our government. I know the officer corps that we had, that we worked with, I had great respect for them. Most of them were command pilots. That means you had really lots of hours. I think there was wonderful camaraderie, and there wasn't, with your crew chief and with the people working for on your airplanes, there was never a feeling of you're so in charge, you're so dependent upon those people. You don't want to walk around strutting around as Mr. Big. That you're on a team, and you're the pilot, and you're a key person on the team, but that team that keeps you in the air, keeps you armed, is a very, very important part of that team.
Yeah. Anything else you'd like to add?
So I guess I carry that on a little in my business, because when I did take this over, one of the things that I implemented was a monthly meeting with my staff, all the staff, mechanics, salespeople, parts department. And I did that for a number of years. I always had a Christmas party. We always had a Christmas party, and we invited not only our employees but their wives, their spouses, and all of their children. And we have a picnic every year doing the same thing. I walk through my shop every single day. I know my people in my shop. I think it's just wonderful to own a business that I can still be a part of. My son Rob is in complete charge, but I come down every day at 9:30 and stay until about 2:30 or 3. I guess I'm retired, but it's kind of fun putting my finger in the pie.
Yeah. Do you belong to any veterans organizations or anything?
No, and I'm a joiner. I was in a fraternity here at Cornell. I'm in the Rotary Club. I've been there for many years. I've been in the City Club, very active in that. I like people. I always have liked people, and I think that in my business, I deal with people every day. And I thoroughly enjoy that. And I think that part of that was the Air Corps. You got used to working with people. When I became adjutant, that's a very powerful position in a squadron. And I thought at 22, 23 years old, that was a lot of responsibility. So that early on, I had responsibility for service.
Do you think the A-bombs dropped were really the end of the war?
No question about that. No question. I took Marianne, my wife, to Japan, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and we went to the bombed out areas, and they've rebuilt beautifully. In fact, we stayed with a Japanese family, and there was no animosity. But then we saw all the pictures of the devastation. There's no question. We would have attacked Japan. We would have slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Japanese. We would have lost thousands of people. There's no question. And people can say, what a terrible thing to do. It was a terrible thing to do, but had we attacked Japan, the slaughter of the Japanese would be much more than those atomic bombs.
Yeah, it's a war that still goes on in a lot of people's minds. I mean, there's still a lot of people that have strong feelings.
Oh, certainly. If you're sitting, if you're a professor sitting in a university, what a horrible thing to do.
Yeah.
If your life is on the line, you're going to attack Japan. That was a wonderful thing.
Yeah, I agree.
It saved us.
Yeah, no, it is. It really was a defining moment. It's a terrible way to bring things to closure, but it was a defining moment.
Well, but the Japanese, they would have had pitchforks. They would have had everything. They would slaughter their population, tremendous number, if we attacked them.
Yeah. Anything in closing?
Yeah, nice to chat with an old friend.
Yes. Thank you, Dave. Thanks for your time. I think it's a great interview, and I'll see that you get a copy of it.
Might be fun.
Thank you.